We're in Pioneer Village. It is a historic museum that is on the former fairgrounds of the Kern County Museum. Over the years, beginning after World War II, various historic structures from all over the county were brought here. And it ranges from houses to a one-room school, a church, a hotel that was out in the oil fields. We have some structures that are original to the site as well. But the majority of the buildings were either moved in or constructed on site as reproductions. So for example, we've got an oil derrick from about 1910 that was constructed on site. So really the three buildings that we're highlighting at the museum today are three homes that belong to three different families, very different families economically, religiously, and politically. The three houses that we're going to visit date also to three different time periods. So the Howell House was built in 1882, the Howell House was built in 1891, and the Pinkney House was built in around 1900. So you get kind of decade by decade a sense of the history and the furnishings that pertain to those different time periods and the families that live there. We're in the Howell House at the Kern County Museum. The Howells were an early family that came to Bakersfield, California. They came here in the 1870s, and really Kern County didn't get going until around that time period, 1860s, 1870s. And predominantly the county started off through mining, and that's what brought people initially to the area. And then they moved down from the mountains into the valley due to agriculture and oil in later years. Well, Kern County looks very different today than it did back in the 1860s and 70s. The Kern River flows into the valley into a delta, and the river wasn't channelized into canals like it is today. So there were large areas that were swampy, lots of mosquitoes, lots of reeds, and then there were also areas, large areas that once you got away from the river with no water and that were desert-like. So in the 1860s and 70s, there were some various people like Thomas Baker, the city founder, who channelized the river into canals that brought water to those arid areas and then also dried up the swampy areas, making the land usable for farming. William Howell came here in 1877. His parents worked in a grocery store. And then Mr. Howell, his father died when he was about 18 years old. He went to work at the courthouse running the machinery that provided water to the courthouse. Mr. Howell learned shorthand and became a court reporter here in town. He went on to become the county auditor. He was a founder of Security Trust Bank, which then became Bank of America, and was on the board of Bank of America from about the 1920s to the 1950s. The house that we're in is a Queen Anne style Victorian. It's about 4,000 square feet. It has 4 bedrooms in the upstairs area. The Howell family were very well-to-do by the standards of the day. They had live-in servants the entire time that the family lived in the home. Initially, Mr. Howell lived here with his mother and his sister, and they took in boarders. But in later years, he got married and raised his family here as well. This house is not your average house, your average middle-class family's home. It's very, has some unique details. So, for example, it's got a made-call system, which I've never seen another house in Bakersfield with that type of a system. It also has a speaking tube or an intercom system that runs from the dining room to the upstairs hallway so that they didn't have to yell up and down the stairs. So there's some, pretty modern, high-tech for the time features to the home. So this house, at the time that it was built in 1890s, it was located a couple of blocks from the courthouse and just off of the main downtown business area, within just a few blocks of that business district. So typically, the residential area surrounded the business district here in Bakersfield. We're in the Howell House. This belonged to Alphonse and Henrietta Howell. Alphonse Howell came to Kern County and worked initially in a store, like a mercantile, up in the mining district, a town called Havilah. That was originally the county seat of Kern County. And then after a couple of years, mining kind of waned, and he moved down to Bakersfield and started his own store here in downtown Bakersfield. He had this house built for his bride Henrietta in 1882. Mr. Weil was well known throughout town and served on the volunteer fire department. He was a mercantile owner, and so numerous people came into the store and knew him through that capacity. The Weils were an upper middle class family. They made quite a bit of money through the store, but Mr. Weil also had various investments like in oil and things like that once oil was discovered in Kern County around the turn of the century. The Howell House and the Weil House actually were right across the street from each other, so they did know each other well. In numerous pictures that we have of both families, you can see the house, the other person's house across the street. Weil's department store was a long time running operation. A lot of other mercantile owners came and went over the years, so Mr. Weil definitely had a business plan that worked for this community. His family lived here. His daughters went to UC Berkeley. Surprisingly for Bakersfield, there were a lot of women in the late 1800s and early 1900s that went on and got educated at the best schools and advanced degrees even. There were several female doctors, dentists. Both of the Weil sisters traveled to Italy and studied with Dr. Maria Montessori to learn early childhood education techniques. Blanche Weil also worked with Alfred Adler in Vienna and went on to have an illustrious career in early childhood education. Unfortunately, he had one son who took over the business, but then none of his children had any children. So the business kind of waned after, when the Weils became older and were unable to operate the store, they ended up selling it, and then it went out of business. We're in the Pinkney House. This belonged to William and Amanda Pinkney. They were African-American family. William Pinkney was from South Carolina, and he was the first generation born after slavery, so his parents were both slaves. So the Pinkneys came to Kern County in 1884, and after the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction that was pretty good, but then you get into the Jim Crow era, and lifestyle for African-Americans in the South just wasn't that great. So a lot of people came out to California, both African-American and white, after the Civil War, because of the opportunity that California had to offer. It was beautiful weather, there were a variety of jobs to be undertaken because of the gold rush and various industries that took off around that same time period in the 1880s and 90s. They came out to California to pick cotton. So at the time, a company here in Bakersfield called the Kern County Land Company recruited families from the South to come out and pick cotton on a one-year contract. And they would provide them with housing, meat, flour, every week. So it was a really great deal. The Pinkneys were definitely a middle-class family in Bakersfield, and they moved into this house about 1900. This house is a pretty small family home. It's got one bedroom and living room and kitchen area. The Pinkneys also had a house behind this house that their daughter and her husband lived in later years. Very small home, but very cozy as well. This house was in Bakersfield, but at the time the city limits had just been extended down to include this area. So the majority of the business district would have been about 4 or 5 blocks away. The buildings were brought here to the museum so that we could interpret the history of Kern County, going back to the early days in the 1860s on up to about the 1950s is probably our most recent time period that we interpret here. These buildings signify our journey through time, the people that lived here and worked here and raised their children in this community. Without knowing where you've been, it's hard to know where you're going, and this is a constant reminder for school children and families that visit this area of the history of our county.